It was 1977, and I was living at that time with my mother and brother in Chesapeake, Virginia, neighborhood called Holly Cove. And right across the street, a friend of mine was playing a record that really changed everything in terms of my scope, love, and understanding and appreciation for music. I remember this record so profoundly because at the end of the song, there was a chorus of voices that came out and said, "Everybody's got a little light under the sun." And then under the sun was repeated into fade out. Under the sun, under the sun, under the sun. The song was called Flashlight. The group was called Parliament, is called Parliament Funkadelic. And it is that ending verse, "Everybody's got a little light under the sun," is a title of my first book that I published in 2019, entitled "Everybody's Got a Little Light Under the Sun: Redeeming, Restoring, and Reconciling the Biblical Story Through Drama for the African American Community." I'm Brother Heath L., and just wanted to give a book presentation, if you will, of my first book, and sort of giving a breakdown as to why I felt it was necessary to write a book of this nature. Again, this goes back, this story and this book really, and retelling the biblical story goes back to my childhood. The very first stories that I ever heard told, were stories from the Bible. Grandparents being in ministry, my mother being in ministry. I'm a child of the parsonage. And so hearing these biblical stories retold over and over again was a part of my upbringing, not only Sunday school, but in workshops and conventions and conferences and wherever there was a gathering of people of the Christian faith, I would hear these stories retold. Have always been fascinated by biblical stories. I was always fascinated with the human element in divine communication with God, and how there would be a revealing, an unveiling, a renaming in many cases where names were renamed, where people were renamed, where people would find salvation. Some would find damnation. It dealt with a multitude of human dynamic elements that I found intriguing and interesting as a child, because again, I was always attracted to the stories. And so that was always significant for me, from watching the early biblical movies, from Cecil B. DeMille's The Ten Commandments, every Easter, the night before Easter, when ABC would show this 4-hour epic, and my brother and cousins would be running around the house doing other things, but I would be right there in front of the television watching this story all over again. Biblical stories done on Jesus and other dynamic biblical stories that were portrayed. I was always intrigued and enraptured by these stories, which led, of course, to my gift and calling in acting, majored in drama in college, and that became a part of my eclectic in terms of being able to portray or identify an element through dramatic portrayal. That's always been a part of my gift and who I am. And so upon graduating from Hampton University in 1990, there were some significant things that was happening within my life personally and within the collective of the society at that time. There was a resurgence of Black consciousness in America, Black consciousness politically, socially. Spike Lee was coming out with movies like School Days and then Do the Right Thing. Public Enemy was out at that time, bringing consciousness through the hip hop genre format. Poor Righteous Teachers, Brand Nubian. There were so many, KRS-One. There were so many MCs and groups at that time that was touching upon us looking at who we are. X-Clan, another group that I can mention. And so with that, personally, I finally accepted the call to the preaching ministry, went away to seminary, the Hood Theological Seminary in Salisbury, North Carolina. And it was there that I began connecting with and associating with many personalities who were into African studies. So yes, I learned a great deal of things socially, a great deal of things politically that we've been engaged in our fight for justice in America. And then I began to discover some things theologically. I began to challenge the question or challenge the notion that had been presented to me by many of my Muslim brothers and sisters that Christianity is a white man's religion. When I began to discover historians and authors and instructors like Dr. John Henry Clark, Dr. Yusuf bin Yakinen, who wrote The African Origins of Major Western Religions, Dr. Cheikh Anta Diop, and so many others that begin to unveil and unfold and reveal that what we know to be Christianity actually came from a nation or group of people in America who were never considered a people at all. And I began to understand that there was a question as to the identification to who the original Hebrews were. When I began to read Dr. J.A. Rogers' book, Sex and Race, volumes 1 and 2, where he begins to deal with the indigenous origins of the ancient Jews or ancient Israelites or ancient Hebrews, it began to shine a different perspective on my understanding of the scriptures and identifying in a way that I had not identified before. Again, being into stories and being into dramas and movies, I was always intrigued by those who I considered to be defenders for justice, your superheroes, if you will. And that was great. But many times my identification to these heroes and heroines, they were not reflective of my community, even though my first real heroes were the elders in my own family, were those who I looked up to in my own family, but I did not see them reflected in the movies and the plays and dramas that I was drawn to. And I definitely did not see them reflected in the scripture that I was given a foundation basis for. And so I began to really start asking some questions. And so following that, and when I finally pursued my doctoral of ministry degree, I wanted to find a seminary that was gearing toward theatrical or theater arts or arts in general. And the only school that I was able to find at that time in 2005 was the Wesley Theological Seminary. The one track that they had was arts and theology. Again, being a major, in my undergraduate years, majoring in theater, acting being in my preference, even though I have done some writing and directing, I was drawn to that. And so as I began to embark upon getting or obtaining my doctoral of ministry degree, what I began to discover was that there had to be a re-communication about the iconography that Western churches have had on their stained glass windows, in their teaching material that was reflective of a community, but it was not reflective of the indigenous community of those who the scriptures were talking about. I began to look at the geographical locations of where many of these stories originated. And what I discovered and what I found was that the geographical locations were traditionally and originally inhabited by people of darker hue, darker complexion. And I began to ask, well, why would the church not just, if we say that those who worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth, well, where is the truth about where these stories originated, who these original people were? It is significant because racism institutionalized is still running rampant, not just in America, but all over the world. There are still now women of color all over the world because dark complected human beings are not regarded as beautiful or regarded as valuable. Only the lighter complected, close to white, is still regarded as valuable and beautiful. Many of them are actually depleting the melanin from their skin. They're taking products that's lightening and whitening their skin. In fact, they're having adverse reactions with all kinds of skin cancers and skin disorders that have arise from this. And so when I begin to look at that, I begin to ask myself, we need to re-examine this. And so images are very important. Many of us remember the test study that was done with Black children and looking at black and white dolls. And if you look at any of those studies that were done in the early 50s and 60s and even in the 2000s, you'll find that the Black children overwhelmingly chose the white dolls as being more beautiful, divine, wholesome, righteous. And the black dolls were regarded as criminals, ugly, evil, wicked. And that's something that deals with the psyche of our children. And so, thus the presentation and the writing of the book that I'm sharing with you all on today. Now, the dramatic part, why drama? Why the utilization of drama in reinterpreting the biblical story? Well, I found that in my discourse as a minister, I began to create what I called sermonic dramatizations. I began to identify biblical characters, write monologues, and then portray those biblical characters for the congregation. Because what I find is that whenever a story or an ethic or a thought is communicated dramatically, it remains with the observer a lot longer than it would if you just simply was giving a lecture or even a sermon. Not saying that they are not impactful or effective, but there's something about watching the story played out that really draws the people in. And so, again, I want to thank each and every one of you who have already purchased the book. The book can be found either on Amazon or on my website, heathcheek.com. You can purchase it from either one of those portals. And I am also available for those who would like to broaden and have workshops and studies on this in your communities or churches. I'm willing to do that. And I just want to say that in the promotion of lifting up and looking at the connection and valuable influence that people of African descent, especially in America, have had, it does not diminish or delineate or push away any other ethnic group. What it says is that this group, this people who have been marginalized, have been racially degraded and set apart and made mockery of, that we are closer to the biblical story told in the Judeo-Christian ethic than we realize. And so it's just a matter of re-examining and representing who and what we are. So thank you so much for watching. Peace, love, and blessings. Brother Heath signing out.